What about the precious metals, gold and silver? How will gold and silver react if the scenario of higher inflation for longer plays out?
Well, if you look at 1970, the price of gold was $35 an ounce. It's now over 1900, and it's been kind of easing off a little bit lately, and it may ease off more. But it was a reasonably good inflation hedge. Considering what is the risk of owning gold, you understand? If you place it, my worry about placing money on deposits with the banks is that the banks cannot repay you one day. That is always a risk that US investors experience with some regional banks. But if you have gold and you keep it in a safe in your house or in a bank or in a depository institution, it's relatively safe. Government may take it away one day. Since they managed to lock you down, they can also do all kinds of nasty things to you in the future. And since so many people seem to be in love with communism and socialism, I wish these people had lived under the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They would not be endorsing socialism with so much enthusiasm and always argue that the government should do this and the government should do that, when it's been proven empirically throughout history that the private sector performs better than the government sector and the bureaucracy. In Eastern Europe, nobody in his right mind would want to go back to how it was under communism. It has nothing to do with the Soviet occupation or the influence. It has to do, they don't want to go back to state ownership and the command economy. They know the private sector is performing better and that people work harder when they have an incentive. So if someone works hard, he earns more, and if someone is lazy, he earns less. But under communism, the lazy were rewarded and the hard-working people penalized.
I want to ask how much credence you give to the BRICS nations creating their own currency, supposedly to be backed at least partially by gold. Could this pose a threat to the US dollar as an instrument of international trade? What do you make of this development?
Well, I'm convinced that over time, the importance of the US dollar as a reserve currency will diminish and eventually be eliminated. It's only a question of time. The way the Spanish peseta was eliminated and the way the British pound was eliminated as a global currency. They still exist in local currencies. But I'd say it's not going to happen overnight, but we can see increasingly the trade shifting. Say in the 1960s, 1970s, 80% of global trade went through Europe and the US, in other words, through the G7 countries. Now this has diminished, and more trade is between Saudi Arabia and India, and Saudi Arabia and China and Brazil, China and Nigeria, and China and the rest of Africa, and so forth. So the natural development is that eventually Chinese and these countries will bypass the dollar and settle either in Chinese yuan or RMBs or in Nigerians nairas or whatever. So this is natural, and it will happen, but it's not going to happen overnight because the world reserves are still predominantly in US dollars. But they will, as a percent of total reserves, they have diminished and they will continue to diminish, in my opinion.
What is it that you're seeing in Latin America that makes you bullish?
Actually, buying opportunities in Latin America are very rare, and not just rare. It comes along once every 10-15 years. But I started to invest in Latin America in the mid-80s because Asia had gone up a lot in the 80s, and Japan was in the sky, and I looked at other opportunities. So I started to travel to Peru and to Ecuador and to Argentina and Brazil and so forth. And then these markets went up 30 times afterwards. And I feel now they're not as cheap as they were then, because in 1986, the Argentine stock market total value, the total market cap, was less than $600 million. So it was indeed very cheap. Now it's worth more. But they're relatively cheap compared to, say, the other global markets. In fact, everything is relatively cheap compared to the high-priced sectors in the US market, which are the FANG and related stocks, AI-related and silicon-related and semiconductors and so forth. So the rest of the world is relatively low. And I described this the following way. In 73 and in year 2000, we had a narrow advance in the US in the case of 73 in the so-called Nifty 50 stocks, and in the year 99-2000 in tech and telecommunication. Now, when these markets began to go down in a bear market, they dragged down initially everything. But after 2000, the resource sector came up, as you may well remember. Now, in the case of Japan, after 89, Japan in 89 was 50% of world stock market capitalization. So everybody thought, oh, when Japan goes down, it will drag down the other markets in the world as well. But that didn't happen. The money flowed out of Japan into the US Nasdaq and into other markets around the world. So my view is, in the US, you have different views. They're very polarized. Some people say the market will be bullish for a while. And there are some indicators, like the Kopok indicator, that would suggest the market is in a bull market. But other indicators suggest the opposite. So nobody knows. But my view is that whatever happens, some money will move out of the FANG and FANG-related stocks into depressed sectors and depressed countries, including Latin America. The reason I pick Latin America is that some of my intelligent friends, I'm an optimist, but some of my intelligent friends, they think that World War III has begun. If you get into World War III, the fronts will be, say, between Europe and Russia somewhere, and between somewhere in the Pacific between the US and China. But Latin America will be relatively insulated. So if you want to be diversified and you believe that World War III is a possibility, I think some money in Latin America will be relatively safe. I mean, nothing will be safe, but relatively safe. People have said that Venice will be underwater in 5 years for the last 200 years. And we have photos, because the problem of history is that before about 1870, we didn't have photographic cameras and no film cameras. So when we talk about Roman history, or if we talk about the Bible, we rely on sources that existed a few hundred years after the event. So you have to be very skeptical. And even today, if you talk about World War II, in Germany, the interpretation is a little bit different than in Anglo-Saxon countries, and so forth. But the one thing I want to say, we have photos of the Statue of Liberty. It's on an island, I forgot the name. But the Statue of Liberty in 1910 and today, the water level is exactly the same. I just saw pictures. In some areas there are floods, and in Venice there are canals that are empty because there's not enough water. And someone sent me the articles, Time Magazine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal of the 70s. In the 70s, they all warned of a new ice age. That would be terrible, an ice age. High temperature has advantages and disadvantages. I mean, you could plant wheat in Alaska in future, or in Antarctica. And of course, my friends who live in the mountains in Switzerland, they are all climate activists, because they say no snow, no business for St. Moritz and Davos and Zermatt. But there would be more agriculture. You understand? For the farmers in the mountains, the worst is the snow. So I can tell you, if the option is another ice age or another hot period. In a hot period, the animals will grow. The dinosaurs, they thrived under high temperatures. They didn't thrive under the freezing conditions, that I guarantee you.